Hey folks, Chuck Black here. We're doing 52 weeks of Python. We're in week number 41, and the topic for this week is the use of Flask in Quokka. What is Quokka, you ask? Well, Quokka is that application that I built that's a full-fledged application that has a nice user interface. It has a whole lot of stuff going on. You can not only look at devices and hosts and services in the same way that you kind of can in our little application. If you recall here, we did this a little while ago. It's a little bit small, but the actual screens that you can look at, you have your hosts table and you have your devices table and you have your services table, and it was a small implementation. That was what we did in the last session that we were looking at, but what we're actually doing right now is looking at the actual Quokka implementation. Now, I mentioned that Quokka is a lot more involved. You can see that there's a whole lot more going on inside this Flask application in Quokka than in the little thing that we built, so I'm going to point out about that. Now, I'm going to spend about 30 minutes attempting to explain to you how Quokka uses Flask. But in actuality, there's so much about Quokka that you may drown in some of the information there. So what I try to do is do a simple explanation of how we start things out and how things go. So there's this init program where we look at what actually happens when we create our Flask application, which is the same as we did before. But if you are dying for more information about Quokka, you need to know that you can go and get these. There's 16 different videos. There may even be more, 16 videos that go through. Everyone's like 30, 40, 50 minutes that talks about Quokka in detail. Now, that's not like Flask stuff, because Flask plays an important role, but it's pretty straightforward what it does. But if you want to know more about Quokka, you should go there to learn more about it. You can also go to the wiki page that I created specifically for this purpose that has nice pictures, which I'm sure you will like, and it explains how everything works with diagrams and things of that nature. Yeah, here you can see Flask and SQL Alchemy and Napalm, RabbitMQ, Scapy, and Map, etc. going on. So if you're interested in more information about Quokka, please visit those things. In this particular lesson, we're just going to be touching on how Quokka uses Flask. So with that as a hopefully decent introduction, let's get started. All right, let's start to talk about the use of Flask in Quokka. Now, in order to understand that, I want us to have a little bit of a reminder of what we've been talking about and where we've just come from. So this is a screenshot of what I did when we were last together. We were talking about using Flask to build this mini Quokka type thing. And so I built in these host monitor, device monitor, service monitor. You can't really see that. And I had these display little applications, and they were using and utilizing this Flask application that we built. And the purpose of the Flask application, it had a REST API, both for setting data, which happens by these monitors, and for reading data, which happened via these displays. And in that situation, we kept data in our global memory. I've since implemented code to store it in an SQL database and also to store it in a Mongo database, but for our purposes here, that's immaterial. This is basically what Flask is a set of REST APIs that allow us to do that. So looking ahead to what does it mean when we're implementing Flask in Quokka, let's remind ourselves what Quokka is. And you may or may not have a recollection of this, but Quokka is this program / product / whatever you want to call it application that I wrote at the very beginning of doing 52 weeks of Python, and I was intending to use it as a teaching platform, and I'm using some of it for teaching. A lot of the things we've done in 52 weeks of Python I am able to do because I implemented it in here. But let's look at the product and refresh our memory of what it does. So we have a devices table that's similar to this devices screen that we have up there. There's a hosts screen. This host screen, notice it's in a nice GUI in a browser, which looks nice and has a lot of functionality. But that's similar to what we had over here with this host's screen that's running in the terminal window. So it's kind of the same to that. And then services, I'm not going to move this away, but services is the same general idea. So I have something that is monitoring these things. It's updating the database, and there's a lot of REST API stuff going on, but there's a lot of stuff going on in the background as well. Now, one thing I did want to point out is that there's some extra stuff that's done by Quakka that is not done by our little mini Quakka that we implemented. And so what would those be? Well, if I go back to devices here and we look at our devices, I can drill down and get time series data. Now I haven't implemented that in our mini Quakka yet, but I certainly could, but I haven't done that. That's one of the things that we've done. Another thing that we've done is we've created the ability to do packet capture. So I could say start capture and some captures would be going on. So that happens as well. If I go back to devices here, I can do, there's configuration diff, there's traceroute. I can do all of those things for hosts. I can do regular host scan, and I can also do an extended port scan on those hosts. And I can also, and it's more important for where it's more interesting when I do it for services, I can do something like this where I can do a trace route, and it's going out and getting that, and it's getting the data from a worker that is separate from the Flask application and returning this information to me. So I'm showing you this so that you have an awareness that a whole lot of stuff is going on in this Quakka application. And so when I show you the difference between what we've done and what Quakka is, you won't be quite so amazed or startled or whatever. So let me move this out of the way, and let's go back here, and I have a slide that shows the difference between the thing that we've just implemented and the thing that I just showed to you, this Quakka. So let's look over here on the right. This is my SQL Alchemy implementation. I built this slide so that I guess for this, even though you haven't seen my database implementation, but this is basically what we've implemented. This is Flask right here. Maybe I should have put the word Flask inside that, but yeah, why don't I just do that? There we go. This is Flask now, so you know that this is my Flask application. I also, while I was there, modified this piece of the slide to show that that is Flask. But let's put our attention over here on the right. Basically, we have this little Flask application, and if you recall in the code, all we basically have is the ability to receive REST calls and to satisfy those. Those calls can be gets to get data. They can be calls to put data. That would be to save data. So all of that stuff is going on in our little application. And through that, we can build these host monitor, device monitor, service monitor, and others as I've built since we did this. And we can get the information and display it using these independent autonomous display functions that come in and read it from the REST API. Now, one thing that I'll mention now that I will mention again is one of the nice things about this design is that I can run these host monitors and device monitors wherever I want. In other words, it doesn't have to be on the same system that I'm running Flask because I'm using HTTP to update this stuff. So I could have, these are effectively remote monitoring functionality. Now contrast that to the way that I've done Quakka, which is kind of grew out of a seed of wanting to create a nice application running in Flask from which we could talk to devices, and it kind of grew and grew and grew into this thing. And so right now, what you should understand is in Flask's implementation in Quakka, all of that stuff that we do externally, we're doing internally inside of the Flask application via multiple threads. So I'm using concurrency in order to do all of these things and have them going on in the background. So just pause for a minute and get it into your mind that this is a major design difference. These are two fundamentally different ways to design the application. I'm not saying one is better than the other. At times, I think that this one over here, it's good. It kind of grew out of what I did, and it's nice and self-contained. On the other hand, this one has the advantage of being more distributable in terms of its monitoring functionality. So just two differences there. So I did want you to be aware of that. Now, one thing that you also want to be aware of that I've talked about a little bit, and that is that there's a whole lot more going on in Quakka than there is on my little mini Quakka application that I'm working on and implementing over here in our 52 Weeks of Python class. When I did Quakka, I built it as a large application. So the structure of my Flask application is going to be fundamentally different, and I just followed the guidelines that have been put out there for how to build a Flask application. As I mentioned, all of these things are running internally, so they are running on their own threads. They go out and do stuff. They summarize data. We maintain the database. All of that stuff is running inside of here. There's not any stuff that it's not located externally as it is over here in my 52 Weeks of Python. So just be aware of that as we go into it. Also, a lot of the stuff that we saw, it's running in super user mode or root mode, depending on how you want to refer to it. And so I have these external, what I called remote workers for doing packet capture, for doing port scan, and for doing traceroute. All of these require super user functionality, and so I have them running external from my Flask application. Well, you'll notice these things over here, they're already external, and so there's no need to do remote workers. In fact, you can think of these as remote workers just in and of what they do. So they are doing similar type stuff. I can be adding capture, port scan, and traceroute if I choose to do so, and they will be just like these applications that you see here. But in the Quakka application, I'm having to manage those and do things kind of in the context of Flask. So that is something else that you need to be aware of. So yeah, let's before we go too much further, I want to tell you a little bit about how you can learn more about how Quakka is implemented. So if you are wondering to yourself, gee, that Quakka thing is really cool, how can I learn a little bit more about it? In case you haven't been aware of this, I can show you there's a couple of main ways. Number one, if you go to my GitHub page, that's GitHub Chuck A. Black, and you can go into Quakka. I have the code not only for 52 Weeks of Python here, but also for Quakka. And the Quakka wiki, as you can see over here on the right, I've created a whole lot of pages and a whole lot of information that explains what Quakka is and how it does what it does. And so you can come down here and say, oh, I want to see how Quakka is implemented. And then you can see this, and you can see my kind of design goals, information about the implementation. I do have some nice pictures that explain Quakka in general, what it does. I go into a little bit more detail with the different things that we're using. This is Flask, SQL Alchemy, Napalm, RabbitMQ, Scapy, Nmap, etc. And then I have all of these other pages that talk about things like the REST APIs that I've implemented with lots of nice, interesting pictures. So if you are interested, if you're at the level where understanding a little bit more about how real live applications are built, if you're ready for that, then you can certainly dive in here, and I have a lot of information for those of you that are interested. Now, if you would prefer not to read, then what you can do is I do have YouTube playlist. I have a YouTube channel which you may be watching this on, and if you're in the 52 Weeks of Python, you may or may not know that I have other playlists. I have two other playlists that are of interest. One of them you can see down here. I have Quakka walkthrough, so that is about 18 or so different videos that are all 30 to 40 minutes or so, where I walk through the actual code that implements all of this. So it's basically a very long version of what I'm going to show you today. And here's our 52 Weeks of Python. And then I have something where I built Quakka. I start to build Quakka from scratch. I only have 4 videos, and I only get to the most basic part I'm actually glad that I did that because we're going to dive into that later on in order to see a super simple version of this Flask implementation. But those videos are also available to you. So here's the Quakka from scratch. You can see there's 4 different videos. There, let's see, that one's only 8 minutes, 21 minutes, 27, 34. The Quakka walkthrough ones tend to be closer in the 30s. I say that, and then I look at this one, it's 55. Some of the others are in the 30s. Maybe they're more like 40, I guess, on average, but you can see. And so here, so Flask application setup and initialization. If you're more interested in, if you want to go and see how I did that in more detail than what I'm doing here, here's some more initialization. This is my views. Those would be the REST APIs. Here's my database. Here's me importing devices, services, things of that nature. Here's me starting up the background threads. These are all in the Flask application, the startup for these things. So if you want to either learn more or put yourself entirely to sleep, then feel free to look at these and you'll get more information about what is going on in there. So that is that. I showed you Quakka from scratch. Yeah. So let us take a look at some of the code. Okay, so here I am in the Quakka from scratch VM, and when I said that the implementation that I started in Quakka from scratch is bare bones, I was not exaggerating. In fact, I may be insulting bare bones because there really is just bare bones to this. So let me briefly go through the structure of the application. Now, Quakka is built as a large application, and it uses this larger application structure, which in our situation, this would be Quakka, and this your application.py is actually going to be our Quakka directory that has a bunch of stuff underneath it. I designed it, as you can see over here, as a model view controller model, and so you can learn more about that if you're interested in the Quakka walkthrough. But basically, the main thing to know is that something that is going to happen is that your init.py is going to get called, and so init.py is where your initialization code is. So let's look here at init.py, which is this file right here, and basically I'm doing the same thing that I did in the other Flask stuff. I import Flask, I create my application. Now the next thing that I do is I do these views. So let's go down here just so that we know this should look familiar to you. I'm doing nothing different than we've done before. I do my app.route and I specify the URL, and this is the function that it's going to do. Basically, it's going to import my devices and it's going to return those devices to me. Now, everything else that you see here has to do with the database. So there really isn't a whole lot going on. There's the RESTful API where I read stuff in, and then there is database stuff, and stuff gets added to the database here. So that's kind of what's going on. Just to show you that it actually works, here's Postman. Let me show you that it's actually running. Here is my tiny little Quakka that's running. If I come in here and I make this request, you should see another get here. There's the get that I just did in Postman, and here's the output. So basically I'm calling in to that URL. Remember, it was called devices. That's what we looked at here in my app route. It's devices, and my output was the devices. I noticed in the code that I'm actually reading it in again. So I'm not actually reading it from the database in this situation, I believe. But that is the initial amount of Flask that I've done in this Quakka from scratch. So what we're going to do now is we're going to go to the real Quakka, and there you'll see that it's definitely not bare bones. There's a lot of code in there. So let's take a look at it. All right, so let's jump into the code, but I do want to say this. If the only thing that you get from this little session today is the difference between the 52 weeks of Python version of Quakka that I've built and Quakka proper, that is the one that I've implemented that does all of the fancy schmancy stuff. If you just understand the difference being that we're doing stuff outside in these little applications, making it perhaps simpler just using the REST API versus the way that I do things as more of a full-fledged, full-bodied application in Quakka. If you just understand that, then probably that is job done right there. But let's take a look at the code and drill down a little bit and see this. Oh, and by the way, if you really are seriously interested, then you do need to look at all this walkthrough code. It's very easy to understand stuff from here. In my opinion, I've gotten some decent feedback about it. So yeah, that's what I would look at. But let's look at the code. So remember our Quakka server. This is the mini Quakka. So this is the one that we just did. Remember all it was? It had these global data structures that I said don't do this, and we're going to move that to a SQL or Mongo database. But all we had basically were these REST API implementations. So REST API for hosts, for devices, and then for services, and that's all that we had. So compare that to my initialization routine over here in the real Quakka. Remember underscore underscore init underscore underscore. That's how you do, that's the pattern of structure that we have for running a full-fledged Quakka application. Sorry, a full-fledged Flask application, and that happens to be what the real Quakka is. So let's take a look at it. First, I'm importing from Flask, this Flask thing. Don't worry about this. This allows external browsers on different systems to come in, and without a level of security, we don't have certificates and all that. So that's what that allows. So in this line right here, we are just creating the application. That's the same thing that we did in Quakka from scratch, and it's the same thing that I do in this mini Quakka implementation. So that is exactly the same. I set up this value to be false to get rid of some warnings. And then what I'm doing is I'm getting all of these device monitor, compliance monitor, interval, etc. This is where I'm reading from the command line to know how long I should wait in between doing my monitoring tasks. I'm going to set up my database. Here I'm setting up my database. So that's how I begin to initialize my database, and I will later finalize that down here by importing all of my models. And we're going to be going through that with our SQL Alchemy, which will be the next thing that I'm talking about, database.createAll. In between, this is where I set up all of my views. What are views? Those are the actual routes that I set up here. So we call these endpoints. You might call them the URLs, the things that people call into. UI events, UI reset devices, reset hosts. Up, I'm in miscellaneous ones here. Here I have my device views for the UI. So if I go down here and I drill down, then I'll see here's where somebody can get all of the devices. Here's where we get some device info. So this one is a little bit different than the one before. This one is getting configurations for device. This is where we get status for device, etc. So these are just exactly the same as what we've done before in our Quakka server, where we had our route, except our route was much simpler. We just had hosts and devices and services. That's all that we had. But obviously, if we go back here to initialization, you can see there's a whole lot of different URLs that are getting specified. And just so you know, for those of you that haven't gone through the walkthrough, there's a number of UI views for, like we saw, we briefly looked at reset and some of that. There's ones for getting device information, for getting host information, service information. That's for the UI to come in via. We have workers that can come and give us packet captures. We have workers that can come and give us port scan views. We have workers that can come and give us trace route views. And we have workers that will just report on their health. And that's what this is. I implemented this different way of doing devices, wherein devices use our REST API to tell us that they're healthy, doing what we call a heartbeat. And that's what worker views do too. They do send in a heartbeat. But these are all of the views. And what do the views do? Well, we like to look at host, so let's go down to host because it tends to be the simplest. So here we are in host. In this situation, I'm going to be doing a get of hosts. And what am I doing? Well, I'm going to be returning this information. Remember, we talked about the fact that, and I'm pretty sure that we talked about this when with Flask, what you do is you can just specify a Python data structure like a dictionary. You can't do a list, but you can do a dictionary, and it will do the JSON transformation so that this gets sent via JSON in the reply to the GET request. And what am I doing? Let's just take a peek in here, get all hosts. If I go look and see what get all hosts is doing, this is database stuff that you don't understand, but basically I'm going to the database, I'm reading all the database objects. For all of the objects, I'm trimming off all of the databasey stuff and changing it into a dictionary and then returning that. And so when I come back to this particular return value, that's going to be the host in the form of, I think it's a list that it returns. Then that's what it's going to eventually return, is this dictionary with the key of hosts and then this list of hosts right here. Host status is pretty much the same, except we're going to be getting a couple of parameters. I need to know the identifier of the host and the number of data points that I'm supposed to get. So here again, I'm getting the request arguments. Remember, those are the query parameters. I'm making sure that what was passed in was correct, and I am saying in my return, what I'm returning is a dictionary that has 3 items. The first item has a key of host data, and that's where I go down and get the host status data. The host summary goes out and gets the host summary data, and the host, it actually returns the information about that specific host. And if you want to know what that looks like, let's go to our Quakka, and let's go to hosts table. I hope I still have this running. And let's go to a host and get this information. So here we have, you can see the output is kind of wonky because I've had it running and then not running for certain periods of time. I brought down the VM in this time, and here you can see from March the 7th until March the 21st, that March the 22nd, that's today, I wasn't running Quakka. So I was actually doing a bunch of other stuff in the 52 weeks of Python. So you can see here there's a big gap. It looks like I ran it once on the 19th, or that's probably the 19th. And so yeah, it's getting hourly summaries. It's done one for today, but that's about it. So, but this is the status data that we were looking at. So let's go back to this. This is the host data, which is status data. The host summary data, that's the stuff that's over here. Whoopsie. I'm looking at my wrong thing. Here's what I wanted to look at. This is the summary data. It's pretty boring, of course, because I haven't been running it all that time, but I think you get the idea. And then the host information, where is that going? Well, the host information is what I'm printing over here on the left in my nice user interface. So let's go back to init and see what else happens besides that. So let's continue on. We're in init. We have completed all of these, looking at these views. This was associated with the database, so we're not going to look at this. And now the next thing that we do is we go and we import all of this information from YAML files. So we get our list of devices, we get our list of OS versions that we're looking for and configurations that we're looking for. And we have services, so we go out and do gather the services that we are going to be monitoring. And then we learn about the workers that are going to be out there. Those are our remote workers that are doing traceroute and packet capture and port scanning. So that's what we're doing there. Is where are the hosts importing, you ask? Well, we automatically discover the hosts, so we don't have to do any importing of anything because we're going to go out and discover those ourselves. Now the next stuff is where, remember in this picture, let's see if I can pull it up reasonably quickly. Remember, in this picture, we have devices, compliance, host services, summaries, all of this stuff running inside Flask. Well, that's what this is going to be doing. We're going to be starting up all of these different threads. My picture doesn't show everything, but I have device threads that I'm going to be starting up, and it's going to be for device monitoring, it's going to be for compliance monitoring, and I go out and get configurations like every hour or something so we can look at the config diff that I mentioned. And so those are the different threads that we're going to go out and be doing. Service thread, yeah, that makes sense. Discovery thread, that's for discovering hosts. Host thread, that's my host monitoring thread. So my discovery thread runs every like every hour or something like that, and the host monitoring thread is going to run every couple minutes to make sure that those hosts are up in my situation. Summaries is the thing that goes out and gets hourly summaries. Worker thread is the thing that allows us to monitor the workers that are out there, and then and to communicate with the workers when it is time for them to do stuff. And the database maintenance thread is the thing that goes out there and it trims the database. So we don't want our database to grow forever. There are certain things that we might want to keep forever, but if you've dealt with any type of server or host or system, you know that you can't go on adding data forever, and I certainly can't in my little VM that's implementing Quakka. So I go out and I delete stuff that I don't think that I need. And that, my friends, is basically it. That is what happens. That's the Flask stuff that happens. What is going to be going on is these things are going to be running in the background. And then beyond that, everything else is REST APIs making requests to us. And we will have requests coming in from the UI. There will be requests coming in from workers. In fact, let's just remind ourselves what these views are. We have UI-based views, so we'll be listening for those. Remember, we had this situation where if there is a remote device that's communicating to us via HTTP, which none of the Cisco ones or anything that I'm doing is doing currently, but that would be what that's for. These are for the capture worker, port scan worker, and traceroute worker to send us data. So they get given a command and they go execute it, and they send us incrementally bits of data. So port scan is one piece of data, traceroute is one piece of data, packet capture, for every packet that comes in, it gets forwarded to us and we put it into the database. And the last thing would be worker views. That's similar to the device views in that it's a worker sending us a heartbeat. So I implemented that a while ago. And what does that look like? Just so that in case you're still confused, this is my workers. My workers are this shows me if they're up and running. I don't have any actual remote workers running on a different system, but I do have these local host ones up and running and responding to requests there. So that is Flask in Quakka. Hopefully that makes a little bit of sense to you. As I say, if you want more information, the place to go is to look at this wiki, which I spent a lot of time, created a lot of cool pictures. So if you do have questions about it, please go visit there. It is, if you just go to my Quakka GitHub repository, and you click on wiki, then that will take you to the wiki, and you can bounce from this page to every other page that you want. There's also, as the GitHub does, is it gives you a list of things if you want to go directly to a specific page. Finally, if you want to listen to more YouTube videos, because you can't get enough YouTube videos, then let's see what channel is. This is showing you the different channels. There's the Quakka walkthrough, of which there are, I think we saw 18 Quakka from scratch. If you want to know how to set up a VM, that's primarily what that's about, is setting up a VM 100% on your own to do development of the Quakka stuff that I built. And it's probably, there's not 100% of the libraries because I continue to incrementally add to it, and I did record that quite a while ago. So anyway, there you go. Hope that makes some sense to you. Let me just end with reminding you of this picture. This is my use of Flask in Quakka, and it is much more significant in terms of its girth. It's doing a whole lot. Over here, we're doing these little separate, independent, discrete little applications that do stuff. And this is just two different design ways to do things, but they're both using Flask. And Flask is this center point where everybody communicates to and via. So the UI communicates there, the workers communicate there. And in this situation, there's a bunch of stuff running. And in this situation, there's a bunch of stuff that are using the REST API to update the database. Hope that helps you to understand the use of Flask in the Quakka application. Okay, let's do a super quick review of what we talked about. We started by looking at what we had done before, where we've come from. I had this little application that really, the Quakka server, this mini Quakka thing, doesn't really do a whole lot. It just sits there and takes data in and stores it in wherever it's going to store it, and takes requests for the data and pushes it back to these displays who are asking for it. And we have, in this situation, a service GUI. It's really a command terminal GUI and a host one and a devices one. And we compared that implementation, which looks basically like this, with the actual Quakka implementation, which is fundamentally different. The monitoring and all the work gets done external to Flask in my little application in order to keep things as simple as possible. In the actual Quakka implementation, I created threads which did this stuff. And this is, I said, if you understand this, then this is like my main goal, to have you understand this. We then bounced around to the Quakka from scratch, where we saw a little bit of what goes on. And then we looked at the code here, and we saw how Quakka actually uses Flask in pretty much the same way as it's used elsewhere. We import it, then we declare it, and once we've finished getting everything set up, then we declare our views. And in these views, we have things that specify our route. So our route is going to be the URL or endpoint, also known as endpoint, that somebody's going to come in from in order to make a request. So we saw that there was that. And then basically, once we got rid of doing the importing configuration data, then we start the threads, and that's basically it. The threads go out and do their stuff, similar to the picture that we were looking at that showed that, yeah, there's a bunch of stuff going on there. And we did, at the very beginning, we looked and reminded ourselves of what Quakka is and does. So that's what we talked about. Hopefully it made a little bit of sense. Yeah, thanks for listening.